Good evening. There are a lot of lawyers in the room, I'm pretty sure. That means there are a lot of people who are accustomed to public speaking. So I'm going to ask you whether you ever had a dream like this. You were invited by a distinguished group of lawyers and public servants in a state you care a lot about to come and speak to a group of people who really care about the rule of law. And you get excited and you prepare your speech. And then they tell you, oh, by the way, right before you speak, the governor of the state will be giving her version of the rule of law. We know the audience elected her. We know the audience will be very probable in supporting her for her future elective endeavors. You'll be fine, don't worry about it. Welcome to my life. So with apologies in advance for any possibility of anticlimax, with your permission, what I'd like to do is just talk in the time we have about a few key facts. One, what exactly is the rule of law? I mean, if you're here tonight, you're already in favor of it, but it's useful to know what you're in favor of, I find. I mean, sometimes maybe better to keep your mouth shut, but in this instance, maybe good to know what it is. Second, where does it come from? Third, why is it good? And I will give you both a principled reason why it's good and a very bottom line, pragmatic things that you get out of it account of why it's good. I'll say just a brief word about why we need to talk about it now. The governor already did an incredible job of covering that, among many other things. And then last, but very much not least, I want to try to provide some actionable intelligence for everyone in the room of what you can actually directly do to help preserve the rule of law. And with any luck, that'll grow out of what I'm trying to say about what the rule of law is and why it's good. Okay, so that's the game plan, and I will try to do it succinctly. The rule of law is a framework on the books, and it's an actual way of life that's instantiated by a group of people, a community of people, in a particular place. So start with the framework part, which is in a way simpler, though it's kind of fascinating. The framework is the idea that in a given government, a given community, because all governments are intentional communities of people who've gotten together to decide how to govern themselves. So within a given government, we've agreed on a framework of rules, which we call laws, that we're going to apply to everybody equally. So there's a component that's about system. There's got to be a system of laws out there. There's an individual component. If you have an encounter with the government, or if you have an encounter with another citizen or another person on a legally related matter, then you individually and they individually are entitled to the law being applied to you. And finally, it's got an equality component. Everyone is going to be treated the same under this rule of law principle. That's why on the US Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. at number 1 First Street, it says equal justice under law. That phrase, which interestingly doesn't appear in the Constitution, was chosen to go there because the job of the Supreme Court is more than any other job. It has other jobs too, but its most important job is to make sure the rule of law is followed. Okay, so that's the framework nature of the rule of law, and in a second I'll talk about alternatives. The part of the rule of law that is a way of life is a component that is much less frequently observed. There are lots of countries in the world that, if you read their constitutions, have the rule of law. And judges from those countries come through Harvard Law School practically every week. People come from all over the world. And the judges are coming kind of for the pleasure of being in a place where everyone agrees with them that the rule of law is important. Because a lot of them are from countries where the rule of law is just not that important or is ignored. And if they're judges, and they're the good kind of judges, they're trying to stand up for the rule of law, and they're not always winning. I mean, I would love to tell you they're always winning. The rule of law is on the march globally. No, the rule of law has its moments globally, and a lot of people think it's a desirable idea, but actually putting it into effect is way harder than just having rules. You need a whole culture of people to come to expect that when they encounter the government or when they're in court or in some other framework of context where they're dealing with their neighbors, that the rule of law will actually be followed, and they have to do something when it isn't followed. They have to give their assent to the system, and they have to withhold their assent from the system when it's actually not working. Now, we are so fortunate in this country. I mean, almost unimaginably fortunate that it's been already in historical time since the early 1970s, which the governor referred to, the Watergate scandal, when we had a big, public, uncontroversial moment when we said the rule of law is not working. Because we had a president who broke the law and who, when confronted with the evidence of breaking the law, said, okay, I'll resign. He didn't say it right away. He didn't want to say it. He actually didn't hand over all of the tapes that the Supreme Court said he had to hand over. But in the end, he did acknowledge his failings by stepping down. He was pardoned within 30 seconds. Okay, let's be clear. I don't want to overstate it, but it's more than a generation ago, in historical terms, 52 years, more than a half a century, since these things took place. And the privilege that we have, and it's an extraordinary one and a great one, and I'm grateful for it every day in my line of work, is that until now, we haven't had to stand up and defend the rule of law. Because everyone in our relevant community, within our way of life, just took it for granted. That was true of Republicans, that was true of Democrats, that was true of independents. That was true across the board. And anyone who arose who said, I want to use force or violence or non-legal means to change the way things are around here, was definitionally seen as an extremist, whether they came from the left or the right or someplace so wacky that you can't map it. Right? That is privilege of knowing that we're all in agreement about something. So that is the challenge that we're facing, and it's why, as I'll say in a little bit, we're going to have to think about these problems now more clearly, and also why it's hard for us. Because a lot of what I'm going to suggest that we do, you're going to say, well, yeah, we know that, but it's kind of hard to do. And there's a reason that it's hard. The reason that it's hard is that the rule of law is not just rules, it's a way of life, and we're used to the way of life, and we are unprepared for the challenge. I want to be clear. I'm not saying, oh, we're soft. It's good to be soft where the rule of law is concerned. It means the rule of law is working. So it's good. But now we're going to have to toughen up in some practical ways. Okay. Now, I said that you don't have to have the rule of law. And to use a concrete example of how you don't have to, consider the government that's done more to bring hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in the last 30 years than any other government in the world, and that's the government of China. To be more precise, it's the Communist Party of China, which de facto is the government of China. Now, communism is not in favor of the rule of law. Communism formally rejects the rule of law. You know, if you really want to know the reason, it's that Marx, the dominant theorist for all forms of communism, thought that the rule of law was a swindle. It was a swindle so that one social class, bourgeois people who possessed basic property, would get what they wanted. And in consequence, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't have any commitment to the rule of law. It also thinks it's a swindle. Now, as they've gotten bigger and more economically complicated, it's beneficial to them to have courts, and it's beneficial for them to have rules, but they don't have rule of law. They have something emerging that the scholars call rule by law. The difference between rule of law and rule by law is that the rules are on the books in both cases. But in a rule of law system, it doesn't matter who you are, the rules apply to you. And the people whose job it is to apply the rules take it as their sworn duty. They have taken an oath to promise, and they take it seriously as part of their way of life to do this, to treat every person who comes before them the same way. In rule by law, you call your party's superiors, and they call their party's superiors until you find someone who says, okay, we know what we're doing, and they tell you how to apply the rules. Xi Jinping did an enormous amount to reduce corruption in China by prosecuting, if that's the term, senior members of the Communist Party who were corrupt. The rules said you couldn't be corrupt. So that might sound like it's rule of law, but it wasn't. It was rule by law because he picked the people who he didn't like to enforce the law against. By the way, it still worked for everybody. Even the people he liked said, oh, maybe my corruption should maybe be changed now. The rule by law system will scare the living daylights out of you. It's supposed to. But the key point is it's a personalized system. It starts with one person at the top, and it applies to you individually, not as just a citizen like everybody else, but as an individual person who is either on the right side of authority or the wrong side of authority. Okay? That is rule by law. And I'm using the example of China not to be a big China hawk in this particular conversation, but for a specific reason. I want you to see that for many people in the world, rule of law is not that big a deal. And if you look at countries around the world that are asking, should we do more of the American democratic system, or should we be more looking into a Chinese system, I have bad news for you. As someone who, as you heard, cut my teeth helping to develop an Iraqi constitution, later worked on the Tunisian constitution, you need to have either an invasion or revolution to get people to work on their constitutions, which is a separate problem. But the reality is, right now, when those things happened, no one in Iraq thought, oh, we don't want a democratic constitution. Nobody. Nobody. Nobody in Tunisia after the Arab Spring thought, oh, let's adopt a Chinese Communist Party structure, the People's Standing Committee. No one thought that. Everyone's instinctive reaction was, I wasn't free, now I'm free. I want to have a better economy. I want to live well. I want the rule of law. I want democracy. 15 years later, that's less obvious to a lot of people around the world. That's why when we come to the rule of law and why, which I'll do in just a second, I'm going to emphasize that there are moral reasons to want to support the rule of law in addition to practical, pragmatic reasons. Because there are plenty of practical reasons to not want the rule of law. Now, the last thing I want to say before I dive into that is I just want to give the other side its due, explain why some people think the rule of law is a mug's game. And I don't think this is a crazy view. I think it's wrong, but I do not think it's crazy. So the idea begins, and it's a very old idea. If you have to name someone and make them responsible for it, you could blame Plato. He's dead. He's not going to object. Who think that all forms of government come down to a person. Could be a really good person. Plato said it was a philosopher king who always makes the right decision every time. It could be a terrible person. It could be a tyrant. And so your fate is going to depend on whether you're lucky enough to be ruled by someone who's wise and good, or whether you're unlucky enough to be ruled by someone who's terrible. But the core insight here is that all acts of telling people what to do should be personalized. Why? Because everyone's different. The world is complicated. You want to get stuff done? You should pick and choose what you think the right outcome is, and rules don't let you do that. The rules say the case has to come out this way. And you see this in the writings of judges, no matter what their ideological preferences, all the time. A good judge will always have a lot of opinions where she says, my instincts are here, the equities are here, but the law is here, the law wins. That's not a trivial thing to say. The judge is admitting that it's the wrong outcome. But it's the right outcome because the system of law requires it. The standard view that is the critique of the rule of law says, that is so dumb. If you're the judge and you have the power, why would you ever say, so-and-so should win as a matter of morality, but the other side wins? No, it doesn't make any sense. That's the critique. That's a real critique, folks. And it's alive and it's well. You don't have to think that the President of the United States is a philosopher king, and I'm not even sure that he thinks that, although maybe on some days. You don't have to think that the other system isn't ideal, because no one thinks that Xi Jinping is a philosopher king. But a lot of people in China seem to be more or less okay with the way that he's doing it, provided he's continuing to grow the economy. The rule of law, in contrast, is a very radical idea. We're so used to it that we say it and we all nod and agree, because it's our way of life. But it's a very radical way of life. And it was implemented by a very radical group of people who had fled the old country and Europe to come here to North America, to the area in which we now live, covered roughly by what is today the First Judicial Circuit. So that's Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. Also, Puerto Rico was in the First Circuit, but that's not where they started. That was a different group of people from Europe. And in that area, that New England area, the Europeans who came and in some complicated and, in our terms, clearly unjust way, interacted with and displaced the people who actually lived here, those folks were radicals. And they were radically committed to a version of Puritan Protestant Christianity that entailed the rejection of the papacy. And alongside their rejection of Catholicism and the papacy, and they were not rational on the subject, was the idea that every believer was the same in the eyes of God, and therefore that the same rules that they believed you could find in the Bible, and they took biblical laws, just to make sure you understand how radical they were. These were not proto-secularists. They took laws from Deuteronomy and they put them in the statute book of the Massachusetts General Court, which also included Maine at the time. Okay, that's how radical they were. These are not people who you and I would be like, oh, look at that great liberal. No. But core to their radicalism was the following idea. And that idea is that because we cannot rely on there ever being a philosopher king, because that's a great idea in theory, and no one's ever really seen one in practice for more than a few minutes, we can't run government that way, because to be too personalized is to invite injustice and to undermine the idea of equality. So if you believe in the rule of law, what you're believing in is the idea that the system of rules should apply impersonally to you, even when it's going to produce a bad outcome in the particular instance, because overall it's going to do better. That is a radical idea, and it's not necessarily right. I believe in it. I hope many of you believe in it. I hope I haven't undermined it too much by presenting the counter-argument, but that's an occupational hazard if you're a law professor. I believe in ideas for grown-ups. It's never worth believing something unless you know the counter-argument. So I gave you the counter-argument. This is a radical idea, and it's based on the idea that the rule of law system will work well most of the time, and when it doesn't work well, we'll pay that price in exchange for the certainty that we are being treated equally, that we are being treated fairly, and that if the rule is bad, if the law is bad, we can advocate for changing the law. That's it. That's the theory of the rule of law, and John Adams put it in the Massachusetts Constitution of 1783, which was also the Constitution of Maine as of 1783, that we may be, it introduced the separation of powers, just as the governor mentioned, and then it concludes that we may be a government of laws and not of men. Those go together. Of laws, yay, Aristotle, rule of law, Puritans, and not of men. Boo, Plato, Xi Jinping. That's the formulation. Like, those are the two possible forms of government we're talking about. Okay, so that's the rule of law. Why do we have it? I've already hinted at part of this answer, but I want to start with the moral reason we have it. The moral reason we have it is our belief, and it is a belief, is a belief based on faith that cannot fully be supported by empirical data, that human beings who are fallible deserve to be treated equally by the institutions that they encounter, even when sometimes they would individually benefit by a little more careful analysis of what's fair to them individually. More radicalism. More radicalism. This is not the idea of equity, which is the idea that the way to do justice is to look at any given person and say, well, what do they need to, get along in the world? And then give them that thing. This is the idea of equality, which is the more radical idea that we want to be encountered under conditions that make us the same as everybody else, even when we're not exactly the same as everybody else, because we're not. We're human beings. We vary. That's the moral commitment. What's so great about that moral commitment? I know that the government is not going to pick and choose its friends. I know that when the government's going to provide a benefit to everybody, it's going to give it to everybody. I know that when the government is going to challenge me or charge me with a crime for violating the law, it's going to do that for everybody, and it's not going to say, we don't like Feldman, let's prosecute Feldman. That's a moral principle. It's a moral principle that says, the big bad government's dealing with me, I want to be treated the same as everybody else. I'll give up the favoritism that I might get when I voted for the guy who got elected, or when we're friends. I'll give that up, because there's a moral principle that says it's wrong to treat me differently under those conditions. Now, that's the moral reason for the rule of law, and that's not enough for everybody. Because we're human beings, and morality is great, but it tastes a lot better when you can wash it down with self-interest. There's a self-interested argument for the rule of law too, and it's really simple. You're not always going to be in charge. Whoever you are, no matter how successful you are, no matter how rich you are, no matter how well-connected you are, no matter how many years you've been first selectman in our town, one or two people like me live in a place with a town form of government, you're not always going to be in charge. Someone else is going to be in charge, and it's usually someone who ran against you and beat you that time. In a system that is based on the rule of law, you're promising that when your side has power, you will treat everybody the same, including the people you really can't stand, who don't deserve to be treated well. And you're trading that for the fact that when you're not in power, you too will be treated equally and personally under the rules. That's the pragmatic reason. So if you said to me, listen, Feldman, I live in a place where actually my we've kind of been in charge for the last 300 years. Tell me what's so great about this. I'm like, I got a great moral argument for you. Because that person's not going to be convinced by this self-interest argument. Right? The self-interest argument only works in a place where we trade sides. We have a Republican governor, a Democratic governor, a Republican governor, or any other office. And that's still true in much of the United States. And in historical terms, it's true everywhere in the United States. I'm not going to talk about gerrymandering and the efforts to undermine that. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want to. But for our purposes, I can just say we all live in a political community where power trades places. And in those places, you need the rule of law to be safe. So that you don't have to say, as I've had friends say to me, I'm worried about what's happening. Should I try to buy myself Portuguese citizenship? Personally, there is nothing that can get my goat faster than that, and I get very mad and I get very upset. Nothing against Portugal, they just happen to sell citizenship. Oh wait, maybe we do too. But to me, that attitude is the kind of attitude that doesn't lead to upholding the rule of law or to the success of democracy. That's the attitude of, well, if I don't like the way you're playing the game, I'll take my ball and I'll go home, or I'll go to Portugal, which is not my home. In that system, no one's invested in what's coming next. You have to believe you're going to live here, and your kids are going to live here, and your grandchildren are going to live here, and your great-grandchildren are going to live here, at least here in the United States. And so you have a long-run incentive to produce that self-interested system. Right now, we're in a place where a lot of people in the United States, and I truly am saying this independent of partisanship, where a lot of people in the United States seem like they've forgotten, and this is really true on both sides, that we trade off who's in charge in this country. There's a lot of areas where this comes up. Free speech is another great one, but that's also for the Q&A. Okay, so those are my moral and my pragmatic arguments for the rule of law. I said I would say only very briefly why we need to focus on the rule of law. I'm going to use a statistic. I'm with Mark Twain. There are lies, damn lies, and statistics. But I'm going to use a statistic. It's not perfectly representative, but it speaks to us here in the area that I call the First Circuit. In the First Circuit, since January, there have been 72 lawsuits filed against the Trump administration alleging some violation of legal principles by some executive action. You have to trust me that that's a very high number. The courts have issued at least preliminary judgments in 52 of those cases. Of those, according to analysis that Reuters did, and I didn't get deep into the data. It was in the paper this morning, and I just said that'll be useful, so I took it. I haven't analyzed the data, so don't come back to me and say the data's off. Maybe it is, but Reuters is pretty reliable. 46 of those cases where there's been a decision, the judge has ruled that the Trump administration acted unlawfully, at least in part. 46 out of 52. Now, let me be clear. That's in the First Circuit, and the great majority of the district court judges in this circuit, for reasons that have to do with the way the Senate functions in the appointment of federal district judges, are Democratic presidential nominees. And that's also true on the First Circuit. I think it actually might be everyone who's active on the First Circuit at the moment, although that's going to change soon enough. So I'm not here to tell you that that's representative of the country, but it's still an incredible statistic, because it shows you that what we're facing now is not normal. It's not even what happened in the first Trump administration. And as Peter told you, in the interest of honesty, I actually testified in front of 30 million people on television that the first President Trump in his first term of office had conducted some actions that I believed the framers would have believed deserved for him to be impeached and removed from the presidency. So it's not like I think that what was going on in the first Trump administration was just some walk in the park. Okay? I staked everything I had on taking that position. But this is on a whole different scale. It's on a whole different scale. And I truly believe that even the supporters of President Trump agree that this is different, that it's on a different scale, and that Donald Trump is not committed to the rule of law, but is committed to something much more like personal rule. And I think a lot of those folks, not all, but a lot of folks who strongly support President Trump, think that that's fine given the world as it is. Okay? I'm not faulting them for holding that view, because as I said, there's a respectable intellectual tradition behind it, and you don't have to buy the self-interest argument, although rationally, I think everyone should, but hey, this is the world. Not everyone's rational. Maybe they think if they change the rules enough, they can stay in charge, and then maybe it wouldn't be rational to have the self-interest argument. But I think, and this is mostly based on my conversations with pro-Trump people, and this is not true of everybody. There is also a core of pro-Trump people who say the president is following the rule of law, but say that the derogation from the rule of law already began in the previous administration under President Biden. And I should just say, again, in the interest of fairness, they have Exhibit 1, and that exhibit is the criminal prosecution of Donald Trump by the Department of Justice. Okay? I mean, I really just want to say this as clearly as I can. Democrats cannot say, truthfully, the Trump administration started this. They can say, we think the prosecution of Donald Trump for the January 6th related events was totally justified, and we think that these other prosecutions the Trump administration is starting are unjustified. You could say that. It might even be true. But you can't say, oh, they started it. That's just not true. It was an epochal decision to criminally prosecute the past president of the United States. It had never been done before. Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. He didn't prosecute him. Okay? I mean, it maybe didn't occur to anybody, but one thing Joe Biden could have done was say, I think Donald Trump is guilty of crime after crime after crime. I pardon him. Would have been a good idea? Probably not. But it would have been a way of communicating a condemnation of criminal action without setting the country up for a prosecution that was blocked by the courts, that was ultimately, in a very complex way, blocked by the Supreme Court, and which sent the message to President Trump and his voters that the system was not business as usual. That after we beat you in an election, we then prosecute you. There's no way to prosecute the former president of the United States in a way that's totally impersonal. I hate to say it. I wish there were. The Biden administration tried everything they could. You know, Merrick Garland, federal judge, one of the great public servants, one of the fairest people you could ever meet, one of the most impersonal people you could ever meet, actually, bent over backwards to create impersonal layers between himself and the president, between himself and the prosecutors and Jack Smith's team. They did everything they could do, but in the end, if you've been president of the United States, you're just too big for your prosecution to occur impersonally. So I just, I'm putting that out there because I really want to be clear that this is not, I'm not saying something that is fundamentally partisan, and I'm really not saying something that is where Democrats should be able to say to themselves, our hands are totally clean. This just started yesterday and we had nothing to do with it. That's just not the way the world works, and it's not how the way the world worked here. Okay, so given all of this, we are in a completely new environment where large numbers of Americans are expressing, let's call it, a healthy skepticism about the value of the rule of law. And that's why we need to talk about the rule of law, and that's why we need to talk about where it comes from and why it's valuable, because it's not obvious anymore, and here's the key point, because it's no longer a given that our way of life instantiates the rule of law. It's no longer a given. And once you lose that, it's very hard to get it back. I tried really hard in the car on the way here to see if I could think of a clean example of a country that had the rule of law, lost the rule of law, got back the rule of law. Like a perfect screenplay structure. I couldn't think of one. I'm not saying there aren't any. I was very excited to speak, very nervous about speaking after the governor. So, I had other things on my mind. Maybe there are examples. I don't want to say they don't exist. But none of them came to mind, and this is what I do for a living. So what's the actionable thing to do under these circumstances? And in a way, everything else that I said you can forget if you take away the to-dos that I want to offer you. They all derive from recognizing that the rule of law is a way of life, not just a system of rules. We have to address the problem at the way of life level, not only at the system of rules level. So the system of rules level is straightforward. You see institutions like the presidency disrespecting the rule of law. You begin by saying, that is not the law. And you don't just say it, you back it up by showing you believe in that by going to court. My home institution, Harvard University, got a letter sort of like the ones that went to the law firms, but way worse, because it cut off most of the funding for the university, which, to be clear, is not funding that's like, the word grant is a problem in this context. It sounds like you didn't do anything and they just granted you the money. A grant, in academic terms, is a competitive prize that you get when you apply in conflict with all of the other greatest people in the world at a thing, and you win to do your research. That's what a real research grant is. It's a competitive process. So it was a real threat, and my university went to court. And so far has won in court. That is scary. That is a high risk. And there are plenty of people who think the university should still settle. So I just want to be clear, that's because it is high risk, and reasonable people could say, this is very high risk. Aren't you better off making a personal deal? If you really want to stand up for the rule of law, you have to take the risk. That's on the framework side. You go to court, you make your case, you tell people that you're making your case, you tell people the law is on your side, you hire the best lawyers, and you hope that the judges do their job. On the downside, if they don't, you can criticize them for not doing their job. That's the systemic part. It's pretty straightforward, and it's very important, and it's very high risk. But if you're the person who's under threat, it's also straightforward. And once you've done it, you're staying there saying, like, now what? And if you're a bystander and you're not personally under threat, it's not so obvious what you're supposed to do. Here's where the way of life comes in. First, you must say to yourself first, to your friends and family second, to your community third, to your elected officials fourth, to the internet via social media if you must. And not everyone in the room is an old lawyer, and there are old lawyers who use the internet super well. So anyone here who has a social media account knows exactly what I'm talking about. And you don't have to be the poster. You can just comment. You can even just like. That is still an action. It is still an action. It is a small action, but it is a meaningful action because everybody who cares is checking the numbers. Everyone in the system at every moment is trying to figure out where the public is. I'm going to come back to the public in just a second. So by speaking out, what you're doing is you're saying, this is not normal. These are not the rules, and personal application of the rules is not our way of doing things here, and we don't like it. If you get a chance, you can give the moral argument. You can say, this is not treating me as an equal citizen. If you get a chance, you can make the pragmatic argument. You can say, this is a bad idea. It's going in a direction where when the other side comes to power, they're going to act personally, and they're not going to respect equality. So we don't want that. You can make that argument. Those are great arguments. You can make them as briefly as I just did. They land. But mostly, you have to talk. You cannot think, well, I went to the event. I did my part. And I'm literally preaching to the choir, literally, because you're here. Okay? I'm not trying to beat you up or make you feel guilty. I don't go in for that kind of sermonizing. You're already here. Good. Take the point that we're all in agreement on and say it to everybody you know. Even if you've become that person in the family who won't shut up about it, that also has an impact because it shows that it matters to you. You're signaling that it matters. Okay? Why do these individual actions matter? Well, for one thing, they affect the process of voting. Now, voting is something that the historians are going to look at us in this period of history and be mystified by. And they're going to want to know why it was that the followers of Donald Trump in 2016 and in 2020 caught on to something that their opponents were not as clear on. Namely, that it really matters who you vote for. The parties are not the same. Their preferences are not always the same in every case. And the individual people within the parties are definitely not the same. Even though there, of course, are centrists. I mean, to be clear, I like living in a world where the parties are basically the same. That's great, because that means that lots of reasonable people are negotiating with each other. I'm betraying a preference for that. But it's not always true, and it's not true today. So the outcomes of voting matter vastly and in every consequential way that they can. And that's not just a principle thing. It's not like voting so you have a little sticker that says you voted. It's voting to preserve your way of life. And you have to communicate that urgency to everybody else. We are so safe on the whole in our country that even when there's a bad political outcome, it doesn't really motivate us, that we don't like, it doesn't really motivate us typically to get out and vote. But some people have noticed that if you get out and act, it makes a difference. And it feels inspiring. So that's one reason to do it. That's a crucial reason to do it. But the deeper reason to do it comes back to the idea that the rule of law is a way of life. The only way to fix The way of life, when it's not going the way it's supposed to, is the collective disapproval of everybody of the way we're deviating from our way of life. You have to be judgmental. You have to be very judgmental. You can't be relativistic about those topics. You have to say, it's true that there are rational reasons to not believe in the rule of law, but that's not how we do it around here. We got to be the country we are by respecting the rule of law. That is what we're about. That is what we should be about. And when someone says, well, you know, do you really believe that? The system was always rigged. You say, of course some systems get rigged at some points, and that's bad. We don't want that to happen. So that insistence, that collective judgment, is something that requires everybody. And it's why in a democracy, when we say that the people rule, we don't just mean that the predicted likely primary voters rule. We mean that everybody participates in rule, whether they vote or not, by virtue of their opinion, because that's what democracy ultimately rests on. You cannot have a successful democracy if people don't care. Or if they care and don't act, you will also fail. The system just can't work that way. And you could say, well, that's not that big a deal, so it won't work. And you're right. Maybe we'd still be fine on some dimension. But we wouldn't be the people that we wish to be. So in a sense, the privilege of having been able to go for so long without a challenge to the rule of law has put us in a state where we're not used to getting exercised over threats to the rule of law, and now we need to get exercised. And I don't care how trivial the context is where you get exercised, it matters. And it matters a lot. It matters a lot. So I'm going to close here because I don't think I have a better call to action than telling you that the fate of our society as a rule of law democracy is going to generationally be determined over the next 4 years. We're going to go one way or the other way. It's not going to happen all in one big go, but it's going to be a sustained, very loud, in your ears drumbeat that's not going to stop, certainly for the next 3 years and however many months it is. It's not going to stop, and it's not going to go away because the structures are in place for real, meaningful change. We're going to know the outcome. It's not going to be uncertain. We're going to know the outcome. We're going to feel the outcome on a day in and a day out basis. And it is actually within your power, with your friends, with your families, with your communities, even with that amorphous thing, your social media account, to participate actively in preserving the kind of society you want to live in. So do it. And do it for the right moral reasons if you can. We all want to be treated the same. Do it for the right pragmatic reasons if you prefer. Do it so that when you're in power and then someone else is in power, then someone else is in power, everyone's safe. But by all means, motivate the people around you to do it. And if we do, it can still come out the right way. It is not over. It is not close to over. Most people that you know and most people in the country still believe firmly that the rule of law is our way of life. So let's make it our way of life. Thanks.